Welcome, everyone. I hope you're having a good Sunday. Today, we're going to be talking about the question of prayer. What is it? What isn't it? Why does it matter? And how do we do it? A long time ago, I read a poll that reported that 70% of Americans over the age of 18 pray at least once a week and get great satisfaction from doing so. When I came across this statistic, I found it very disheartening because I was someone who had never felt the least bit better after my sporadic attempts to pray. I'd never received any kind of divine response to a question I asked or a crisis that I was in, to the best of my knowledge. Now, that may have been because I have never believed in the kind of God who existed in order to fulfill my wishes, or one who would especially care about my day to day life. The God I imagined but didn't really believe in had much bigger fish to fry, like creating the Andromeda Nebula. When other people described prayer as this intimate communion with a supreme being, I felt a little bit like the orphan in the fairy tale locked outside in a snowstorm, with my nose pressed against the window, looking at everyone inside being comforted by God, while I was this miserable infidel who could only watch from outside an invisible barrier. I assumed that there was something wrong with me for being such a stranger to prayer. This was a lot of years ago when I was brand new to spiritual practice and I was trying to do everything right. When a Christian friend came over, I told him about my issue, and he informed me I was just being resistant, that I wasn't truly sincere in my prayers, which is why God seemed so MIA to me. My friend told me that prayer had to come from the heart as opposed to the doubting mind, and that as long as I tried to think my prayers, nothing was going to change. Well, this was very discouraging because, for starters, I wasn't a true believer like he was. While my friend was confident and very clear, I was insecure and doubting and confused. When it comes to spiritual experience, I've always been someone who's from Missouri, so to speak. Unless I see it with my own eyes or I feel it in my own body, I just refuse to believe what I'm told. Part of that stubbornness is about protecting the authenticity of my own spiritual path. Because when I first began this life as a seeker, I had felt largely insincere and secondhand in my worldly existence, and I made up my mind that I wasn't going to be fatuous or gullible when it came to my spiritual life. I was going to be ruthlessly truthful, if necessary. I figured that if God was real, then it didn't need me to be gullible in order to communicate. What God would want, I could only guess, were self-reliance, the love of truth, and also a little trust that, having spawned the entire known universe, God would know what I was thinking anyway. Well, one afternoon I opened my mailbox and I found a postcard from my Christian friend. And on the postcard was a quote from the late Trappist monk Thomas Merton, printed in bold capital letters. And it read, quote, "True prayer and love are learned in the moment when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone." Let me repeat that. True prayer and love are learned in the moment when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone. This quote has since become a touchstone for me. We've talked a lot about Merton's insights in the Seeker's Forum before. But back then, it really put me back on my heels, as my friend undoubtedly knew that it would. I couldn't vouch for the prayer part, but the reference to love being impossible sometimes I was very well acquainted with. After many failed relationships, I'd finally learned that it was in those moments when I felt nothing, or worse than that, when I wanted to run away, but managed to stay, to continue trying, to abide, that love was actually strengthened and made real. In Buddhism, this is called practicing against the grain. And by that time, I had enough splinters in my backside to know that this was true. Contrary to what I'd been raised to believe, that love just happens and sustains itself, I'd seen firsthand how testing love only makes it stronger. And that when it comes to growing beyond our limitations, the rougher the timber, the stronger the floor. If testing was beneficial to love, I realized it must be helpful for faith as well, and in prayer too. Apparently, doubting Thomas was one of Christ's favorite disciples, precisely because he wasn't willing to pretend to be certain when he wasn't. Remember, doubt is a precious commodity for seekers, provided that it has curiosity in it and it's not convinced of its own rightness. As a wise person I know used to say, if you're truly in doubt, you must have the courage to turn the dogs of doubt on doubt itself. In other words, we have to be willing to question our own doubts as honestly as we question faith, to find out where our resistances lie, and also what beliefs may be blocking us from opening to new experience. The paradox of Merton's quote confirmed this for me. But yet still, I had no idea how to pray, and I really continued to wonder if I ever would. And then one day, I had an experience that turned my understanding around. This was 25 years ago. I was walking along a forest trail in the dead of winter in Germany, feeling completely miserable. My life was a mess. I had no faith in anything, and I was ready to give up this struggle for wisdom. The snow was heavy on the ground. The pine trees were black against the sky. It couldn't have been a better scene for an Ingmar Bergman movie. Just my spirits couldn't have been any lower than they were in that moment. I was just hating myself for everything, thinking that I should be stronger, wiser, and much farther along the path than I was. I stood there in the forest with the snow falling, just berating myself for a million things, including the fact that I couldn't pray. I was standing there in this clearing, just yelling at the sky, just ranting at the injustice of it all, and wondering what the hell I was supposed to do now. When all of a sudden the obvious point hit me. I'll spare you the profanity of what was actually coming out of my mouth, but the gist of it was that I was already praying. What did I think that prayer was? In a moment of complete desperation, which is often when spiritual insight comes, I finally got it. That the energy that keeps a person yelling at the sky and shaking his fists and whining and feeling sorry for himself is, in fact, the essence of prayer itself. The frantic longing for response, for reunion, for relief are part and parcel of genuine prayer. I imagined that prayer needed to be some polite request of God by the pure of heart, but I'd completely missed the obvious point. I hadn't been frozen and ignorant or shut outside the walls of the holy, but in fact had been offering prayers in my own screwed up way for as far back as I could remember. This is what my voice in the wilderness sounded like: raw, inarticulate, and extreme, full of disappointment, sadness, terror, and existential uncertainty. In Nicaragua, they have a saying that struggle is the highest form of song. Struggle is the highest form of song. And I saw then that the same thing is true of prayer, as it is in love. We long for the sweet, harmonious times when the heart's open and love is flowing. But it's in those shut down, conflicted, impossible moments when love reveals its true face and pushes you beyond who you think you are and what you believe that you're capable of. And the exact same thing is true for prayer. Years later, I came across a commentary from the book of Job that reminded me of that walk in the forest. It read, quote, "By the end, Job's suffering has erased all formality, and he speaks to God directly, challengingly, intimately, just the way God speaks to him," unquote. It was only in his moment of greatest need and desperation that Job was transformed, that he was able to dissolve the distance that he imagined between himself and God. He was humbled and he was enlightened by that humility, and realized that in speaking to God with his true voice, however common and impolite it might be, he was able to approach the divine finally. People of faith call that prayer. Non-believers call it radical truth-telling, self-revelation. But either way, it changes us when we begin to speak plain and drop the pretense of propriety. I saw that prayer is actually a form of self-bonding, not a phone call that never gets answered. You see, those are two very different approaches. And when I realized that it was a form of self-bonding, prayer finally became real for me. Now, there are as many ways to pray as there are individuals who want to meet themselves in this larger context. There are recognized techniques, many that can be practiced, but your relationship to prayer remains yours alone. Because sincerity and presence are all that we truly need. Whether our prayers are verbal or silent, whether they're active or still, whether they involve ritual or improvisation, attention is the important thing, the indispensable thing. Some people chant the names of God, others engage in deep contemplation, others prostrate themselves or whirl or dance or engage in self-purification or even sacrifice, forms of sacrifice. The form of the prayer may stay the same, but its emotional content will change from person to person, from day to day. And if it doesn't, it may be because you're not quite in the room, so to speak. Repetition without presence kills the spirit of prayer. So ask yourself, what is your felt experience while praying, however you define that? And what do you hope for in return? Do you allow yourself to be naked with God, or do you put on your Sunday hat, so to speak, before you engage the divine? Do you imagine that prayer is targeted at a power that's above you or outside of you? Do you only pray when you need something in hopes of wish-fulfilling results? Or is prayer less goal-oriented for you, more like a touchstone than a divine suggestion box? These are really important questions to ask ourselves when considering the role of prayer in our spiritual lives, especially as we move into the holiday season. So I just wanted to make a few suggestions for how to think about prayer and ways that we can enrich the life of prayer, particularly as we come together with the people in our lives. The first is that besides being an outlet for distress or questions or personal need, prayer is also a vehicle for praise and thanksgiving. Okay, when you offer up a prayer of appreciation, celebrating the glory of creation and the sacred connection between all beings, you affirm your own bond with the universe and you bow to a power that's greater than you. Okay, humility becomes a part of prayer, which necessarily brings gratitude as well. So at Thanksgiving this year, try taking the time to express your prayers in whatever way is true for you. It will deepen the experience enormously. The second thing is to allow yourself to ask for what you need without shame or hesitation. Okay? Because speaking the truth in prayer, you can actually transcend the ego with its fears and its expectations and open to new possibilities. There's a great power in free expression that ignites the imagination and opens the way for manifestation. That doesn't mean getting exactly what we want when we want it. It means acknowledging what is true for us as a way of creating space for surprises to happen, which they do on a regular basis when we are paying attention. The third point is in the spirit of generosity. Use prayer now and then to rise above your personal needs. Instead of staying in the receptive or the passive position, you can take the JFK approach to prayer by asking, not what God can do for you, but what you can do for God. Okay? Make contributions in the spirit of prayer. Work toward the betterment of humankind. Offer your services to others. Pray that suffering, including your own, be relieved. The fourth thing is to use prayer as a practice of mindfulness. Notice your thoughts, notice your feelings, your fears, your doubts, your aspirations, and pay attention in the act of praying itself. Do you feel larger or smaller when you pray? That's a good question. And what's the experience of those? What are those two different experiences like? Do you feel enlarged and expanded through prayer? Do you feel humbled and smaller? Both of those can be very rewarding. What do you focus on while you're praying? To whom or to what are your prayers directed? These are fantastic questions to ask yourself. And finally, if I can recommend a practice that I've found extremely useful, try reciting the prayer of St. Francis every morning for 3 months. Use the words as objects of contemplation. Say the lines very slowly. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me show love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, let me not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to everlasting life. Shortly after I had that temper tantrum in the forest in Germany, I bought a book on meditation by a wonderful teacher named Eknath Easwaran that recommended the St. Francis prayer. I did this practice almost every morning for close to a year, just reciting and reflecting on the words of this prayer. And what I discovered that it was like a door that kept opening wider and wider out into the world from a center that felt a lot like God. When I spoke that prayer, I felt the divine within myself. So try it and tell me what you think. And I'd like to make an offer for the new year, which is that if enough of you, say 25 of you, write to me through the Seekers Forum site expressing interest in joining in a group practice, then I will do this with you every day for the first 3 months of 2019. Okay, and then we can correspond about our experience and how it's changing our sense of what prayer can be for us. So if you're interested in doing that, I would love to join you, and it would be our first sort of Seekers Forum, community practice, which I think would be a terrific way to start the new year. So write to me if you want to do that. And now, Jay, let us open up the lines and have some questions. Let me put a question out to folks. That's a good way of getting started. I'm really interested in your experience of prayer. What do you call prayer? When and how do you pray? Have you had an experience of presence when you pray? And if so, how did that change your practice and your awareness of what we call the divine?